So in our last video, we talked about the five main roles slash powers of the president, and we started with chief executive, and in this video, we're going to move on to the others, starting with chief diplomat. So as chief diplomat, the president is responsible for guiding U.S. foreign policy and interacting with heads of other nations. Okay, so as chief diplomat, the president can accept foreign ambassadors. So those are representatives from other countries. So maybe they host some sort of state dinner for a leader from another country. Or the president can negotiate treaties. So treaties are agreements with a foreign government that's negotiated by the president and requires a 2/3 vote in the Senate to ratify. So the president negotiates the treaty with the foreign nations, and then the Senate has to ratify for that treaty to go in effect. So treaties can be about defense, they can be about trade, environmental standards, so on and so forth. Now, it's important to note that the Secretary of State is going to have a big hand in diplomacy and working with leaders from other countries, but the president does play a role as well. The power of diplomacy is partly symbolic and ceremonial, and this would be a good example of that right here. Okay, so how it can be symbolic and ceremonial, so shaking hands for a photo. So the president is also chief legislator. So we talked about how Congress plays most of the role in the legislative process. So the president is really going to have a limited role there. So Congress is going to be responsible for making laws, passing laws, so on and so forth. But Article 2 of the Constitution, which talks about the president, is going to direct the president to give a State of the Union address to Congress. So the president has to deliver the State of the Union address each year. And this is where the president is going to talk about the state of the economy, about the military, any kind of social state of the country. And in this address, the president can often encourage Congress to pass key pieces of his legislative agenda. So, as chief legislator, this is where the president is going to work to get his policies enacted. Okay, so for example, past presidents have worked with Congress to try to get some form of healthcare legislation passed. Maybe it's legislation about clean air and water. So, this is an example of the president working with Congress to get legislation passed. So, as chief legislator, again, the president works with Congress to shape that legislative agenda. The president is given the power to veto or formally reject legislation that's passed both houses of Congress. So, if for whatever reason the president doesn't agree with legislation, they can veto it. Sometimes they can threaten to veto a piece of legislation so that Congress makes changes to legislation before it ever actually gets to the president. Now, it's important to note that Congress can override a veto with a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, but this does not happen very often. Now, last unit, we also mentioned a pocket veto, but we didn't really go into detail about it. And this occurs when a president does not sign a piece of legislation within 10 days during a time when Congress has adjourned or at the end of the session. So if it's the end of a session of Congress and the president has not signed a piece of legislation within those 10 days, that's when a pocket veto occurs and it does not become law. The president also serves as commander-in-chief of the United States military. So the Constitution gives the president authority over the entire military, including strategic nuclear forces. So all military generals and admirals are going to take direction from the president. But it is important to note that the president cannot declare war. So that is a power of Congress. So the president has limited war-making powers, but they can deploy troops without congressional consent. So sometimes it's going to be better for one person in terms of the president to make those decisions in terms of the military than it would be for 535 people to get on the same page. So the president is able to send troops into combat, but only for a certain amount of time with any kind of authorization from Congress. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in this unit. The president is also given power of the pardon. So the Constitution gives the president the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. So the president has the authority to release individuals convicted of a crime from legal consequences and set aside punishment for a crime. So a president would be able to grant someone a pardon and get them out of jail and forgive them of any kind of crimes. This can be somewhat controversial because some people will see this as the president pardoning their friends, okay, or somebody that they knew in the past and getting them off free, essentially, okay, so they're not having to serve any kind of time for their crime. Now, that doesn't necessarily always happen, but it has. One of the most famous pardons is when President Gerald Ford, is pardoning President Nixon. So Nixon is pardoned for any crimes happening within the Watergate scandal. Okay, so it's going to keep him from being punished for any kind of wrongdoing within that scandal, his involvement within the Watergate scandal. Okay, so Gerald Ford becomes president after Nixon resigns. He was Nixon's vice president. He pardons him for any kind of wrongdoing with Watergate. And then the last role of the president is party leader. So in this role, the president helps members of his political party get elected or appointed to office. So the president campaigns for those members who have supported his policies. And the president might use bargaining and persuasion with members of Congress to get support for party initiatives. Okay, so that would be where he would be trying to persuade members of Congress to vote for his policies. Okay, in the role of party leader, helping members get elected. Okay, so an example of that would be when President Trump came to Kentucky during the governor's race. Okay, so he was in Kentucky in support of Matt Bevin. That would be an example of party leader. They're both Republicans. Another good example of being party leader or a leader within the party would be President Obama now. Okay, so he is out campaigning for Joe Biden as his former VP is now running for president. So that would be examples of party leader. And that's where we're going to stop with this video.